Okay. So today we are going to basically do the second part of what we did last class, which is just going to be talking a bit more about good arguments. So the plan is I'm going to start off by just reviewing what we talked about last time, and then we're just going to look at various examples of what some valid arguments, what they look like, just so that when you get out in the wild and are presented with arguments, you're able to tell whether they are structurally sound or not. And that's really all we're going to be talking about today. So really, today's not going to be anything new. It's just going to be some particular examples of what we talked about last time. So to begin, we talked about 2 classes ago and then last time as well, what arguments are. And we said that arguments are just basically ways of writing down in structures, like a written list, it's like a recipe for how you can gain new information. It's a way of reasoning. It's writing down the steps you might take when thinking or reasoning to gain a new piece of information. You can do this better or worse. And there are also different ways of doing it. And so last time we talked about 2 different types of argument, which are really 2 different ways that you can gain new information about the world from things you already know. And what were those 2 types of arguments? Anyone remember? Got it.
I think it was inductive and deductive arguments.
Exactly. Inductive and deductive. So with an inductive argument, does anyone remember what these actually were? What an inductive argument was, or what set it apart from a deductive one? The best way to think about an inductive argument is that it's based on prior experience. So an inductive argument would be something where you started off with, say, a premise 1 of yesterday the sun rose. Premise 2, the day before yesterday the sun rose. Premise 3, etc., all the way on down to a conclusion of the sun will rise tomorrow. And so what this is just making a general claim about something that you haven't experienced yet, or it can be a scientific one, where it can be something like, if I drop this, it will fall, it falls. And every time I do this, therefore the conclusion is there must be some gravitational force that pulls things downwards. You've never seen gravity, you've just seen every single time that you've dropped something, it falls, and therefore concluded gravity must be a thing. So let me stand here so you can see that better. So based on prior experience, an inductive argument is something like yesterday the sun rose, day before the sun rose, etc., etc. And the conclusion is the sun will rise tomorrow. Does that make sense? Just review of what an inductive argument is.
Yeah.
All right. Now a deductive argument, by contrast, is an argument in which you're basically using the meanings of the words themselves and some key simple little words to conclude something that you might not have known before and draw a conclusion that has to be the case. So an example of this is something like, do I have an example here? No, we'll do that in a second. It would be something of this sort. All frogs are amphibians. I don't know how to spell amphibians, so whatever. Premise 1, all frogs are amphibians. Premise 2, Freddy is a frog. Conclusion, Freddy is an amphibian. So you can see here, it's not drawing on past experience. It's instead starting with this general claim, all frogs are amphibians. And if you combine this general claim with this statement of fact, you're able to conclude this further thing that you might not have thought about before, namely that Freddy's an amphibian. And so in this case, it's really drawing on what you know about the meaning of the word all, the fact that the same word is appearing here and here, and that the same word is appearing here, and that the same word is here and here. So that's what a deductive argument is. It's about this drawing on the fact that the same words are appearing multiple times and the order in which they're occurring in order to draw some new information. Does this all sound familiar from last time?
Yes.
Okay. This is just reviewing what we talked about. Now, so that's the difference between a deductive and an inductive. Now, we said for either sort of argument, you can do it either better or worse. And for both of them, there's two parts that go into a good argument. And this was my analogy with cooking, where there's two things that go into cooking well. So in the case of an argument, what are the two things you need for an argument to be a good or successful argument?
Premise.
Yeah, you need to have good premises. You need to have premises that are true or at least plausible. And then what was the second part? Conclusion that's true, but it's not so much that the conclusion has to be true. If it's an ideal argument, the conclusion is going to be true. But if you want it to be a really good argument, it's not just that the premises are true and that the conclusion is true. It's rather there's this special technical term that means if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Valid, yeah. So must be valid. And what we said is that the quality of the premises has to do with whether they're true or not and whether they're believable or not. But whether the argument is valid has to do with how it's put together, how the parts fit together. And what we find is that how you define validity depends on inductive versus deductive. So let me scoot this over. And what we've talked about is that deciding whether an argument is valid or not is going to have different steps you can follow. And remember, the idea of a valid argument is it's basically in the same way, it's like the quality of a recipe. A valid argument is the equivalent of a good recipe. A good recipe is one where if you start with good ingredients, you're guaranteed to have a good meal, or if you follow it correctly, or good steps. In the same way, an argument is valid where if you start with true premises, or at least believable premises, you're guaranteed to learn a new true piece of information. So that's the general idea of validity. And the way we checked it for a deductive argument is you don't check to see if the conclusion is true straight away or anything like that. What you do is you first assume that the premises are true. You then check to see if a conclusion can be false given what you've done in step one. And then if the conclusion can be false, it's not a valid argument. If the conclusion can't be false, it is a valid argument. So let me put an example up. I think I have one over here. Yeah. So here's an example of an argument. What we're going to do here is ask, is this argument valid? So how do we test if it's valid? What did I just say? Well, what was step one? What's step one of checking to see if an argument is valid?
To assume it's true.
Assume both or all the premises are true. So in this case, let's assume it's true that if the big bad wolf huffs and puffs, then he will blow your house down. So assume that's true. And we assume that the big bad wolf is huffing and puffing. Now here's what do we do next? How do we test whether this right here is a valid argument? What do we check with the conclusion? We've assumed this and this. Now what do we try to do? Well, what does our step say? Check if the conclusion can be false given step one. So look here, what does that involve? What in this particular case are we asking ourselves? What are we asking ourselves about this sentence right here?
If it has to be true.
Does it have to be true? So now just think about it. The way you really test is, can you think of a situation in which this would be false even though these two are true? Can you think of one? Assume that it is the case that if the big bad wolf huffs and puffs, then every single time your house will be blown down by him. And assume that he is currently huffing and puffing. Is it a guarantee that he's going to blow your house down?
Yes.
Yes,
No.
it is.
Yeah.
This argument is valid because if 1 is true and 2 is true, you are guaranteed that the conclusion is going to be true. Now let's contrast that with this one. Premise 1, all squares are rectangles. Premise 2, this right here, which I drew, is a rectangle. Conclusion, so this is a square. So how do we test if this is valid? What's step 1? Same as the last one.
We assume the first one is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, we assume the premises. So let's assume all squares are rectangles, and let's assume that this is a rectangle. In this case, they both are true. All squares are rectangles, and this is a rectangle. So is this valid? Is it guaranteed to be true that this thing right here is a square?
No.
No, it is not. In fact, it is not a square, it is a rectangle. So this is invalid. This is not a valid argument. So that's what all we mean by deductive validity, is if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Now, why do you care about deductive validity, or why should you care about this? Well, because if you know, and this is something we're going to talk about a little more, the basic idea is that if you know that an argument is valid, then you're able to guarantee yourself that something else is going to be true, so long as you're convinced of the premises. So if you come to be convinced that the big bad wolf will blow down your house every time he huffs and puffs, and you come to be convinced that he's currently huffing and puffing, then you know the house is going to be blown down. Or to take another example, if climate change is real, or let's say if climate change happens, then water levels will rise. Climate change is real, therefore water levels are going to rise, or flooding will become more common. If climate change is real, flooding is going to be more common, and climate change is happening. So if you convince yourself that climate change is happening, and you convince yourself, or you're certain that if it happens, then flooding is going to happen, now you have reason to prepare for a lot of flooding. So this is just useful where if you know that an argument is valid of this form, then you're going to be able to know that you can draw new information, even if, as long as you can convince yourself of the truth of the premises. So does that make sense? The idea is that you want to be able to recognize valid arguments so that you don't have to convince yourself of the conclusion independently of being able to convince yourself of the premise 1 and premise 2. It's a way of gaining knowledge without being able to convince yourself of this directly. You might not be able to know directly whether there's going to be flooding or not. But if you convince yourself that climate change is real, and you've read a lot and it's led you to the conclusion that if there's climate change, then there's going to be a lot of flooding, then even before the flooding happens, you can predict that there's going to be a lot of flooding. You can also see, therefore, that if you want to disagree with the conclusion, what you have to do is show either A, climate change isn't real, or show that climate change can happen without water rising and without flooding. Does that all make sense to people about what this idea is and why validity is somewhat of a useful notion? And we'll talk about it a little more with more examples, but that's the general idea here. Doing all right?
Yeah.
And Natalie, I saw your message, but I can't respond in the chat because I have no screens up, but I saw it and you're good to go.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So that's all that I want to talk about with this. Now, in the case of let me erase this and do an inductive argument, and we can decide whether that one is true or is valid or not. Last time it rained, my house flooded. The time before that, when it rained, my house flooded, etc., etc. Conclusion: next time it rains, my house will flood. is this a valid argument? So in the case of, let's see, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise, etc. So how do we check if an inductive argument is valid? Well, down here, for an inductive, you first see how many past instances there are that you're pointing to. Because remember, inductive is about using past experience to draw conclusions about future experience. So you first see how many past instances you can point to. If there's a lot of them, then it is a valid or cogent argument. In the homework, I have it written down of tell me whether the inductive argument is cogent. But valid, you can use either one. It's totally fine. It's just one of the books uses cogent, and so I included it in there. If there's not a lot of instances, then it is an invalid or not cogent inductive argument. So looking at this one here, last time it rained, my house flooded. The time before that, when it rained, my house flooded. The time before that, et cetera, et cetera. So my conclusion, next time it rains, my house will flood. Is this conclusion, can you be almost guaranteed, or at the very least, is this very well supported by all my past experience?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Therefore, we would say that this is a valid argument. So this is an example of a valid argument. So an example of not a valid argument is something like this. My cousin's friend's dog's ex-owner's father's sister read a heard about someone who took the COVID vaccine and exploded, and literally exploded. So that's premise 1. Conclusion. So if I take the vaccine, I will explode. Is this a valid argument? My cousin's friend's dog's ex-owner's father's sister heard about someone who took the COVID vaccine and then literally exploded. So if I take the vaccine, I will explode.
No.
No.
No, it is not valid, because this is one thing without a lot of background information, because we test with an inductive argument. The question is, if many times this thing has happened, then anything that follows from it, if you're pointing to a lot of experience, then it's a good sign that the argument is good and you can be pretty confident in the conclusion. If by contrast, it's only a few times, or even worse, you don't even know if it's one time, you heard it through the grapevine, well, then it's not valid. So maybe it is true that maybe you're a medical marvel where if you take the COVID vaccine, you will literally explode. That is always possible. However, the fact that you heard it from your cousin's friend's dog's ex-owner's father's sister doesn't give you reason to conclude this. Now, if like everyone you knew who got the Pfizer vaccine then blew up, that would be pretty good reason to be afraid to take the Pfizer vaccine. But if you just heard it from one person, that doesn't necessarily guarantee it. And in the case of inductive validity, remember the goal is for us to reach conclusions we can be pretty certain of. So if we're going on the hearsay of what our cousin's friend's dog's ex-owner's father's sister said, that's not a good way to reach the conclusion. If, however, we're going on our past experience and it's happened a lot of times, that's a good way of gaining new information. So that's the idea of validity with an inductive argument versus validity with a deductive argument. So does all of that generally make sense here? So everything else we talk about today is just going to be a review, or I guess an expansion on this. Nothing else we say today is going to be anything more than just explaining examples of valid arguments, trying to say a bit more about why we care about valid arguments and how to identify them. But basically, everything else is just going to be restating this in clearer, newer ways. So if you've got this, you've already got everything. that you're going to need. Because what the homework assignment is I give you, I want to say 10 examples. And basically what it is step 1, tell me, is this an argument? Step 2, if it's an argument, tell me if it's inductive or deductive. Step 3, if it's inductive or if it's deductive, tell me if it's deductively valid. If it's inductive, tell me why it is or is not inductively valid. That's going to be the homework. So in some sense, you already know what to do, but I'm going to do some more tips just so arguments can get very complicated. Because at the end of the day, we are people with very creative minds that are able to follow a lot of trains of thinking. You can, when you tried to convince your mom of something as a child, you will over and over again, you could think for days about how you try to convince her of it. Today, when you're trying to convince your friends of something, you can go through many steps and approach from many different angles. However, it's useful to break things down into like the very basic parts. And it's useful to recognize what some of these basic parts that are valid and some of the ones that are invalid. So some of the ways of thinking that are good and some of the ways of thinking that are bad, so that you, when you're coming up with more complicated things on your own or writing a paper, you can think about, oh, I know some ways to try to convince someone of my conclusion. I know some argument forms that are valid, and I know some argument forms that are invalid, and I know what I have to do and not do. So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the class, just going over some examples of good argument structure, some bad argument structure. And so to introduce a little more what exactly I'm talking about, let me pull my boards over. So the way I want to introduce this is by talking about, I'm going to take us back to Algebra 1 and talk about variables in math. Because the way in which you use variables in math is very similar to the way we're going to be discussing arguments today. So let's focus on this example first. What does this mean? X plus y equals 2x plus y. If you were explaining this to someone in regular everyday English, what would you say about this? What do each of these letters mean?
Well, one side of the
number.
equation means the same thing as the other side of the equation. You're just adding them together.
Yeah, so what you're saying is the two things on either side are equal to each other. So that's the first thing, is you're saying whatever's over here is the same as whatever's over here. But like this is a number, 2 is a number. But what about x and y? What do those mean? What do these things actually signify?
They're two individual things. So X is one thing, Y is another thing. So we know that they're different.
This is what we would call a variable. And what does a variable mean? Well, basically all it means is just what Lauren said. It's just this is one thing and this is another thing. And anywhere that this appears, everywhere you see a certain letter, you just plug in the same thing. But it doesn't matter what that thing is. You could put in anything you wanted here. So for instance, anything you put in for X and anything you put in for Y, these two will be equal. So somebody tell me what we should make X. Pick a number.
10.
10. And what should we make Y?
5.
5. So all this is saying is if we put 10 into the X, it's 10 plus 10 plus 5 equals 2 times 10 plus 5, which I'm running out of room here, is 25 does equal 25. And so this is in some sense, an accurate equation, or this is if we wanted to use our logic term, a valid equation, because no matter what number you put in here, you're going to get the same thing. And the point of learning how to do this is it is a lot simpler to be able to write things with variables and know that they stand for anything you want than it is, because really what this is writing this down, that x plus y equals 2 times x plus y. What this is a stand-in for is an infinite list in which you put every single number imaginable in x and any single number imaginable for y, and they will always equal each other. So instead of having to memorize a list of every single math equation for every number, you instead just write down this one thing, and it captures the essence of what is going on in this case. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the same thing can be said for arguments. So when I write down an argument like this, it is an example of an argument that is of a particular form. So to give this, if Thanos has all the Infinity Stones, he will kill half the universe. Premise 1. Premise 2. Thanos has all the Infinity Stones. Conclusion: Thanos will kill half the universe. So this right here is one particular argument. It has one premise, which is an if-then premise. It has a second premise. Put this here. And then it has a conclusion. And what you see is you could write this out, but any other argument that you come across that is of this if-then form, you can write in this same way. So instead of saying, if Thanos has all the Infinity Stones, he will kill half the universe, what we can do is just give this a name. We can say this part right here is A. And we see it here at the start, and we see it here again, and that's also A. And then what we have here is Thanos will kill half the universe. Call that B. And we have right here, again, the same thing. Call it B. So what we see is, even though in this particular case, we have it all written out, in the same way as with a variable in math, you can pull it away and just say this argument has the structure, if A, then B, A, conclusion, B. So does that make sense? In the same way that with a math problem, you can just put variables in an argument, you can put variables in. And this is useful because you can analyze the validity of just this argument structure. And what you find is, if an argument structure is valid, then every single thing you put in for A and everything you put in for B, then if the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true. For any possible example, you can kind of think of it as blank. So an argument of the form, if blank, then blank, if blank 1, then blank 2, blank 1, conclusion, blank 2. No matter what we put in here, if we assume the premises are true, then the conclusion is by definition going to have to be true. It's going to necessarily be true. It's going to have to be the case if it's an argument of this form, because this is a valid argument form. And you can test it. You can put in anything you want for these. And even if you don't know what some of the terms mean, you can still use it to gain new information. So for instance, let me think of something that what is something that you think, what is something that anyone want to give me an example of something that you know to be true, but you're not certain other people will know?
If Biden rightfully won the election.
If Biden, let me think of how I could reason this out. If Biden rightfully won election, he is our president. Biden did win election. Conclusion, he is our president. So here's a case in which, this is a good one because this is something people will argue with. But what you realize is, if you disagree with this argument, if you want to reject the conclusion that he's rightfully our president, then you cannot disagree with how the person got there. You instead have to question the premises. So the person would have to disagree that he did win the election. However, you could still recognize, even if you disagree with the premises, that it is a good argument. Another one is, let me just go with my classic one. If a All right. Here's a new piece of information that you're going to learn, even though you don't necessarily know what all the words mean. What it says, if a dictic is a mammal, then it has a heart. A dictic is a mammal, so a dictic has a heart. Now, how many of you know what a dictic is? Does anyone know what a dictic is? Any takers?
Oh,
No. All right. I will share a picture in a second of what it's a type of antelope. It's a really cute, it's like the world's smallest antelope. It's like this big. Dik-dik, D-I-K. They're native to East Africa, like Kenya, Tanzania, those sorts of places. If a dik-dik is a mammal, it has a heart. A dik-dik is a mammal, so a dik-dik has a heart. So you do not have to know what a dik-dik is, and yet you could still come to the conclusion that a dik-dik has a heart. So for instance, like somebody's asking you, think of something with a heart. You don't even have to know what a dik-dik is. As long as you know that this is true and this is true, you're guaranteed to learn something new. So let me share my screen while I find a picture of one of these little guys. Images. I need one. Oh, here's a good one. Let's see if I can share this. Share screen. Can everyone see this tiny little antelope with this man? That's a dik-dik.
Yeah.
That tiny little guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, you didn't know what that was, and you could still be certain that it had a heart if you accepted these two things. So that's the idea here with validity, is because it's an entire structure that's valid, you don't need to know the details to learn something new from an argument of this form. You just have to know the premises are true, or accept that they're true. So in the same way, you don't have to know where Estonia is, but if you know that you have a connecting flight from Estonia to, say, Italy, and you know that you have, let me think of a way. You don't have to know where Estonia is to know that if you have a connecting flight from Estonia to Italy and your plane is on time, you'll be able to get there or something like that, just because of the nature of the argument. So what I want to do now is talk about some classic argument structures, one of which I've just been going over again and again. And a lot of them have to do with if-thens. So here they are. There are two types of arguments that are of this if A then B form. So first off, let's talk about what a person means by if A then B. So what does it take for something like this to be true? What does it take? If I say if it rains, then I will get wet. What do I mean by that?
A have to be true or it's a fact.
So if A is, so yeah. So if I say something like, if it rains, then I'll get wet. What you're saying essentially is assume the first part that it's a fact. Assume that I'm going to get rained on. Now then, given that fact, it's guaranteed that I'm going to get wet. So if A then B does not mean necessarily B is the case. For instance, it can be true that when it rains, you get wet. And yet you're not wet right now because you're in your house and you're not getting rained on. So anything in the form if A then B, the idea is that if this part is true, then this part also has to be true. So if A is true, then B has to be true. That's the idea of an if-then statement. So the idea with this first thing is if you have an if-then statement of the form if A then B, and you have something A that is certainly true, then by definition, or like necessarily, the second thing, the B is also going to have to be true. So this is what's called modus ponens. I don't care about labels. I don't care about names. But if you're somebody who finds them useful, I'm never going to ask you tell me the name of this thing, but if you're somebody who finds labels useful, this is known as modus ponens. It's just if A then B, A therefore B. And anything of this form is going to be valid. So we can come up with any example we want of something of this form, and it's going to be valid, which is what we just did. I've been using this one over and over again, so I'm not going to come up with a new one here. But here is another one, which is somewhat similar, also uses if A then B, but is somewhat different as well. This is called modus tollens. This is if A then B, but not B, therefore not A. And this is also anything of this form is going to be valid. So if you know that if A then B is true, and you know that not B is true, you're guaranteed to know that not A is true. So just to give an example, if Thanos has all the Infinity Stones, if Thanos had all the Infinity Stones, he'd have killed half the universe. So that's premise 1. Premise 2. But Thanos did not kill half the universe. So, what can we conclude? What are we guaranteed to know? If it's true that if Thanos had all the Infinity Stones, he'd have killed half the universe, and it's true that he did not kill half the universe, what do we know? What can we be certain of in this case?
He didn't have all the Infinity Stones.
He didn't get all the Infinity Stones. Conclusion, Thanos doesn't have all the Infinity Stones. So again, this is going to work for any sort of argument you can imagine. If you had all the best running backs, you'd win your fantasy football league, but you didn't win your fantasy football league. Therefore, you don't have all the best running backs. If you had all the ingredients for pasta, we'd have spaghetti for dinner. But we didn't have spaghetti for dinner, so therefore you must not have had all the ingredients to make homemade pasta. If we had class on Thursday, then we'd be, let me think. If we had class on Thursday, then we'd be meeting on Zoom, but we're not going to be meeting on Zoom. Therefore, we don't have class on Thursday. All of these are just examples of this form. If A, then B, not A. And this is just modus tollens. So anytime in any article, any argument you have with a friend, anytime you see something that is of this form, where if a certain thing, then a different thing, and not that different thing, you're guaranteed that not the certain thing. But if A, then B. So if a thing, then another thing is definitely true. Therefore, another thing, absolutely, certainly true. You don't need to know what the details are. It's going to be a guarantee. Now, what you can do, if you want to disagree with the conclusion here, what you have to do is show that either 1 is false or 2 is false, because something I talked about last time and forgot to bring up at the beginning, validity is just one part of it, and then the other part that went into it was the premises being good. And when you have these two together, you'd say the argument is sound. And if you have a sound argument, then you're guaranteed to get new information. But it is useful because validity is 1/2 of soundness. You need to learn to recognize valid argument structures, valid forms, so that you can then recognize that, okay, if this, all you need to do to make sure this argument is good is assess the premises. On the flip side, if you learn to recognize invalid arguments, then you don't need to worry about the truth of the premises. If somebody's trying to trick you by telling you a lot of true things, but they're doing it in an invalid way, then you can be confident that you don't have to listen to them, even if what they're saying to you is true, because even if the premises they're giving you are true, because the conclusion does not, does not follow from those premises. It's not guaranteed to be true, even if the premises are true. So this is 2 classic examples of valid if-then statement arguments. What I want to do now is pause for 1 second, ask, does anyone have any questions on this? If not, I'm going to erase this and we will then discuss 2 invalid argument types. Netta, do you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to know, is this structure only for deductive?
Yes.
Okay.
So these types of things we're talking about right now are going to be deductive argument structures. So inductive arguments is always, there's not really a straightforward way with an inductive argument of telling whether it's good or not. It's much more of a gray area, and it's always a matter of how much background do you have. So what I would say is sound arguments must have validity and good premises. Valid here doesn't, when we're using valid in our everyday lives, we generally mean it as the same as true. However, in this way we're using it as this term of art in this philosophy class, valid just applies to whole arguments. Kyriakos, did you have a question?
Yes. So since I want to go back to your example with numbers, and since they're so clear cut, like they're always true and no one can argue them. Does that apply to other arguments? Like, you ever experience someone argumenting but only using facts, but someone else doesn't believe them because they're unaware of the facts? Is that a sound argument?
So that would be a case in which it depends on, and this is really useful for splitting apart the difference between validity and true premises. So in a case like this, when you're having 2 people arguing and one of them is using facts and the other one doesn't want to believe the conclusion, there's 2 things that could be going on. One, it could be that they are just refusing to accept the truth of the premises. So going back to a case of, like, let's take this argument. Someone may have just deny that Thanos did not kill half the universe. Maybe they'll say, no, half the universe is dead. You just weren't paying attention. So this person could say, therefore, so you're trying to argue with them, does Thanos have the Infinity Stones? You say, oh, no, he does not. Half the universe isn't dead. They're saying, yes, he does. Half the universe is dead. In that case, you're having an argument about the truth of this premise. That is separate from validity. If, however, another reason they might be denying it is they might be saying your reasoning or your argument you're using is not valid. Now, if somebody is arguing about validity or not, if they disagree about, if they're just unwilling to accept this line of reasoning, it's kind of one of those things where just like you're speaking a different language, you cannot reach a conclusion. If somebody says something that is not reasons in a way that's not valid, there's not really anything more you could say. Like if you have something, like you can imagine somebody who thinks like this. If or let's just say, I'm tired to I'm hungry. Conclusion, I'm not tired and hungry. So do you see right here, look at this argument here. I'm tired, I'm hungry, but I'm not tired and hungry. What can you say to someone who's willing to think in this way? There's not really anything to be said. It's just then you don't understand what the word and means. So in the same way, the idea here with these arguments is you're trying to find out, if you learn the valid arguments, then what you can learn to do is when you're arguing with someone, what you have to do then is convince them of if you want them to accept your conclusion and they're just refusing to, despite the fact that you think your premises are true and you've given them a valid argument, you have to prove to them that the premises are true or get them to recognize that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So there's a few different ways in which it can go wrong. Was that responsive to your question?
Got it. No, yeah, that was perfect.
Okay. And what you find, and what I want to do now is talk about very often we are tricked when an argument looks like it might be valid and the premises someone is giving us are true. We can be tempted to reach conclusions that in truth we're not really justified in accepting. So let's go with a classic case. And we're going to look at 2 different versions of if-then statements. So I'm going to erase these examples. And neither of these, what I'm about to put up, are not valid arguments. They are I'm just gonna write up invalid. Whoop, woo. So this one, if A then B, not, I'm gonna erase these names too. Not B, therefore not A. And this is if A then B, B conclusion A. So this is called affirming the consequent. And this is called denying, no wait, not A, not B. Denying the antecedent. Let me see. B. Yeah, okay. So in both of these cases, if you come across an argument of this form, it might be that the conclusion is true, but if a person argues for it in this way, it is not a guarantee that the conclusion is true. If it is true, you aren't justified in reaching it. You have no evidence. You were just getting lucky. So just to give a concrete example, if you were the murderer, you'd have left the building at 3:30 p.m. So that's premise one. Premise two, you did leave the building at 3:30 p.m. Conclusion, you're the murderer. So this is an argument you might actually find in a court case. A defense or a prosecution might use this line of arguing. They'll say, well, the person died at 3:25. Therefore, if you were the murderer, you'd have left the building at 3:30 p.m. And we have it on tape that you left the building at 3:30 p.m. Therefore, you're the murderer. And they're going to try to convince the jury that this right here is evidence that you're the murderer. But should the jury believe this? Should the jury come to the conclusion that you're the murderer simply from the fact that you left the building at 3:30?
No, there must be
Why?
more evidence because
Yeah, you need more evidence. And why do you need more evidence? Why does this alone not mean that you are the murderer?
because there could have been other people that.
Exactly. There are many other people who could have been leaving the building at 3:30. And just as importantly, or if not more importantly, you could have been leaving the building at 3:30 for a totally different reason. You could be like an Uber Eats driver and you have to bring a sandwich somewhere. The fact that you left the building at 3:30 does not guarantee that you were the murderer. Now, if you were the murderer, you'd be guaranteed in knowing that you leave the building at 3:30 because that's what the first one means. But it doesn't go the other way. So you can put in any other sort of argument in this case, and any one of them is going to be bad. So something like, if you wear our makeup, then you'll be an Instagram celebrity. You are an Instagram celebrity, therefore you must continue to wear our makeup. Well, maybe you're an Instagram celebrity because you're super interesting and fun and you have great like photographic sense. And it has nothing to do with the makeup. Or if you drink our beer, then you'll be happy. And you are happy. Therefore, it must be because you are drinking our beer. So you must go and buy more of our beer if you ever want to stay happy again. When really it could just be that you had a good day. But the company selling the beer wants you to come to the conclusion that what's making you happy is their beer. So does that make sense to everyone? How this looks a lot like the other one. All that switched is the B and the A. However, if you have A as the second premise, you are guaranteed that B will be true if the premises are true. However, you flip it, and even if the premises are true, even if A then B and B, you're not guaranteed of A in any situation. That's called affirming the consequent, and it is a very common way that we try to convince people of things. And if somebody tries to convince you of this, you shouldn't necessarily believe them. You need other evidence. It doesn't necessarily mean their conclusion is false. It just means that the way they're trying to convince you of it is not good. It could be that you're the murderer, but this information alone should not be enough to prosecute you. You need, like, you know, if your blood is all over and you're caught stabbing someone to death, that's good evidence that you're the murderer. The fact that you left at 3:30 and the murderer left at 3:30 does not guarantee that you are the murderer. So does that make sense to everyone of this idea here?
Yes.
We don't have any questions. Natalie.
No. I just said yes.
Okay.
I
All
understand.
right, awesome. So let's go with the other one, denying the antecedent. This is, again, something which can look very, very promising, but is not actually the case, or is not a guaranteed way to get a good conclusion. So if you wash your colored clothes in hot water, they will fade. But you didn't wash your clothes in hot water. Conclusion, your clothes didn't fade. Or actually, let's go. If you dry your delicates in at high temp, they will be destroyed. But you didn't dry them at a high temp. Conclusion, they aren't destroyed. So, can everyone see why this is not a good argument? Why, even if the premises are true, you're not guaranteed that the conclusion is true. So why not? Well, how do we test to see? Well, what did we say? You first assume the premises are true, and then you see if you can imagine a case in which the conclusion is false, even if the premises are true. So can you think of one? What would be a case in which you did if you dry your delicates at high temp, they will be destroyed. That's a true statement. And you didn't dry your delicates at a high temp, but their clothes still are destroyed. Your delicates are still destroyed. Can anyone think of a case in which this might happen?
The machine caught on fire.
Yeah, if your house catches on fire, then your delicates are going to be destroyed, even if you wash them perfectly. Netta.
Oh no, I was just about to say if I don't know, if they had the problem with the machine or
Yeah,
something.
it could be that the machine's broken. It could be that your dog stole your delicates and ate them. Like, any of these things are possible. Another actual practical one would be something like, so this is actually like a legitimate issue. If you let your GPA drop below, I don't know, let's say 3.0, you'll lose your scholarship. Premise 2, but you didn't let your GPA drop below 3.0. Conclusion, you won't lose your scholarship. So this is a genuine, I think, I'm sure some of you have experienced this exact issue with CUNY or with some other school where you've been, where you thought that the only thing that affected your GPA or whether you lost your scholarship was some GPA level. But then it turned out there was some other condition going on. So for instance, and you had to fill out some obscure piece of paperwork by September 5th. And if you failed to fill out that piece of paperwork, you'd still lose your scholarship. So you might think if you let your GPA drop below 3.0, you'll lose your scholarship. And I didn't do that. So I don't have to worry about losing my scholarship. But unbeknownst to you, there was some other piece of bureaucratic paperwork you had to fill out. And so because you fell prey to this sort of argument of, and I didn't do that, therefore I'm safe. So does everyone understand how in a practical case, in our own thinking, we will fixate on this and then forget that there might be other things we have to worry about. So this is another type of thing. This is called denying the antecedent. It's another type of argument which can look good on the surface, but is actually ultimately not a successful way of guaranteeing you're going to get a truth from another set of truths. All right. There's two others I want to discuss that are of the valid variety. We're done with our if-thens. So let me erase whatever's under here so we can, if anyone has any questions about those two, I can pull them back up. But here's just going to be two other straightforward, simple ones that I'm bringing up just because they're useful to know and they can be combined with these other ones we just talked about to make some more complicated arguments. Because, and this is where it gets complicated, is all of these parts can be put together, taken apart, and I'll show you that in an example in like 5 minutes. But here's the last two I want to talk about. Hypothetical syllogism and disjunctive syllogism. Premise 1, A or B. Premise 2, not A. Conclusion, B. If A, then, nope, that's not what I wanted. Yes, no, that is what I want. If A, then B. Premise 2. If B, then C. Conclusion. Does anyone know what the valid conclusion is from if A, then B, and if B, then C? What can you know for certain if this is true and this is true?
That A and C, A and then C or something.
If A, then C. And again, you can come up with examples that make these ones pretty straightforward. So either I'm a vampire or I'm a human being. And I'm not a vampire, therefore I'm a human being. Or either I'm a people use this sort of one in like that sort of facetious in that like turn of phrase, the either he's out drinking or I'm the Queen of England. Like that implies, and we know I'm not the Queen of England, therefore that person must be out drinking. That's the idea here. Or if I say something like, so I tried to give back all the homeworks today. Either I sent you back your home. If you did your homework, then either I sent back your homework or I screwed up and you should email me. So what that means is if you know you got it back, then I didn't screw up. If you know I didn't give it back to you and you know you did it, then therefore you have to email me. So it's the same sort of idea here. If A, then B. If B, then C. Conclusion, if A, then C. So in this one, if it rains, then I'll get wet. And if it's wet, then I'll get grumpy. So whenever it rains, I'm going to get grumpy. Or if it rains, then you should bring an umbrella. And if you should bring an umbrella, or if you bring an umbrella, then you must make sure not to forget your umbrella. So if it rains, then make sure you don't forget your umbrella. Again, these are all just like intuitive, straightforward things. But you can see how these different sorts of things can be combined together. So we can combine this one with the example that of the homework one, we can talk about the homework example by combining modus ponens and a disjunctive syllogism into one longer valid argument. So we can say something like this. If you turned in your homework, then I either sent it back to you or I forgot to hit send. So that would be premise one. So if you know you turned in your homework and you did it on Blackboard and it's there, then another thing you know for certain is true is premise two, which is I did send the homework, which then means, so if you did send the homework and if you turned in your homework, then either the professor, prof, either sent it back to you, or if I turned in my homework, then prof either sent it back to me or he forgot to hit send. I did send in the homework. So what can you conclude here? If you did turn in your homework, what are you certain of right now?
You either sent it back to you or you forgot to hit send.
Exactly. You have this conclusion, which is either prof sent it back or he forgot. Now, given this piece of information, what might you do right now or after class, or you already did this? Where might you go and check for things?
Your email.
Your email. And now if you look in your email inbox and you see that you go in, you know you turned in your homework, and yet you don't see an email from me. So then what you have here, you have this conclusion, a temporary conclusion, or you just have this thing here. Let's just call it 3 for now. What else do you know now with 4? What is something else? If you go into your inbox and you don't see an email from me, what do you know now?
You forgot to hit send.
You know that I didn't send it back. I didn't send it back. He didn't send it back. And from he didn't send it back combined with he either sent it back or he forgot, you now know I forgot to hit send. So this is a completely normal way of thinking. Like this is a train of thought that you might very well reach when you know you turned in your homework and yet you don't get it back. You will come to the conclusion, oh, my professor forgot to hit send. And then you'll probably come to the conclusion, I should bother him and shoot him an email and say, hey, professor, you forgot to send me my homework back. And basically all you did to reason in this way was you use disjunctive syllogism and you use modus ponens. And all you did in this ordinary thinking is you did the modus ponens first and then combined it with this. And so just because you use those 2 valid argument types, you're now guaranteed, you're confident in saying that I forgot to hit send because you're confident you turned it in and you know the only things that could have happened is either I forgot to hit send or I sent it back. And because I didn't send it back, you know it must be on me. Therefore, you can come to the conclusion that I forgot to hit send. It's my fault. You should reach out to me and say, hey, professor, you forgot to send this back to me. And all of that you are certain of because you just did some valid reasoning using regular everyday argument types. So does that make sense, everyone? What we're talking about here are just the building blocks of this more complicated sort of reasoning. And really, it's something we do all the time. It's no different from our everyday lives. All right, that covers everything new I want to discuss today. The only thing I still want to do is go over the homework that was due on, what was that, last Thursday that I finally turned back today. I graded them over the weekend and then completely forgot to hit send to anybody until today. And so some of you might still have been forgotten to hit send. So what I want to do is what would be easier? Do people want me to find the document and share it so we can go over it that way? Or do you just want me to read them off with you looking at them? What's best for everyone?
Probably better to just read it off. I
Yeah.
assume you should have
All
it.
right, so then I'm just gonna pull up the document and read it off, and if you have any questions, I will go over them. So give me 1 second to pull up the documents.
So Professor, before, can a conclusion be like in your last example, like either or? Can a conclusion be something?
Yes, absolutely. So you could have a case in which like, if it's raining, he either remembered his umbrella or he got wet. And if you know, say, it is raining, well, now you don't know for certain what the truth is, but you know there's only two possibilities. Either your professor got wet or he remembered his umbrella. And that's the only conclusion you know, is conclusion either wet or umbrella. You can't know anything more than that from this. For that, you'd need some additional information, but this alone might be useful. This alone might be something you want to do. So it's like, all right, the professor's either wet or he remembered his umbrella. And if he is wet, he's going to be really grumpy. So there's a decent possibility he's going to be grumpy and we should prepare for it, even if we don't know for certain. So even if there's like a 50-50 chance, we still want to be prepared for grumpy professor man. So yes, a conclusion can be multiple steps. And another thing is with ors, you can have like infinitely many here. So it could be something like a conclusion could be like, if you look in your, say you have 4 rooms in your house. You have a bathroom, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. And you've misplaced your telephone. When you go around looking for your telephone, what you're essentially doing is starting with an or statement. You've got it's either in the living room or bedroom or bathroom or kitchen. Because you know you haven't left your apartment and these are the only rooms you have. And you had your wallet when you bought something on Amazon. Well, when you look through the bedroom and don't find it, you have not in bedroom. Essentially, now what you've done is crossed this off. And now your only conclusion, when you've only checked your bedroom, you haven't looked in the other rooms yet, you now know it's either in the living room or bath or kitchen. Or, I guess another one, it's either bathroom, bedroom, or kitchen, or you were robbed. So in this case, it's either in the living room, bathroom, or kitchen, or robbed. And then what you're doing every time you look and find it not in a certain place is just crossing off. And so what you're basically doing when you look for things is just running a disjunctive syllogism down from a big list of ors to a single thing. All right. So I'm just going to go over the homework examples quickly. On the whole, people did well with them. So the first one, Jack is the best person I know. He gives 80% of his money to charity, and he is always willing to talk about any problems I have. That is an argument. This one people had a little trouble with because the key is to recognize that the first sentence is the conclusion of the argument. You don't just see bestness. You instead have to argue for it or give reasons for it. And what the 80% of the money to charity and willing to talk about the problems is those are premises supporting the conclusion that Jack is the best person I know. The second one, it rained so much on Wednesday that CUNY had to go to remote teaching. I hope it doesn't flood that much again. Also, my basement flooded. That is not an argument. It's just some statements of fact. So, number 3, every fish swims. Sam swims a lot. Therefore, Sam is a fish. This is a conclusion, or this is an argument, and the conclusion is Sam is a fish. However, just talking about what we were talking about, that is an invalid argument. Not that I asked about that, but it is indeed an invalid argument. You could conclude that every fish swims, Sam is a fish, therefore Sam swims a lot, but it doesn't work the other way. Number 4, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Not an argument. That is just, I guess, a call to action. Donkeys are better than horses. They are smaller, so you don't have to spend as much to feed them. Also, they are cuter. That is an argument. The conclusion is that donkeys are better than horses. The other two are the premises, that they're smaller, so you don't have to spend as much, and that they're cuter. Number 6. This one was a little tricky. This is indeed an argument. If you tell that story, then I'm going to cry. I don't want to cry, so you shouldn't tell that story. This is just a modus ponens case hidden amongst like what you say to a friend. Number 7, LeBron is still the best basketball player alive. No other player can single-handedly turn their team into a championship contender. Also, he makes everyone he plays with better. The first sentence is the conclusion of this argument. The second and third sentences are the premises. Lastly, they say that if a person's middle toe is the longest, then they are a witch, and her middle toe is the longest, so that means she is a witch. Burn her. So technically speaking, the premises are the first sentence. If they say that if a person's middle toe, yada, yada, and her middle toe is the longest, so that means she's a witch. The burn her bit is technically just some additional fluff that's thrown on, but it's, I guess, kind of part of the conclusion as well. Lastly, basically, if you had anything resembling an argument for this, I just wanted you all to go out. A lot of you found some really funny examples, but basically, if you turned in something, you got full credit on it. Also, I'm glad to see that I'm not the only one who cannot do math. So each of the first 8 questions, there were 8 of them, and each was worth 8. And the second, so how much is that? Math time?
64.
64. And the last question was worth 18 because I can't do math, which meant it was 82. So I had 18 leftover points. So you just got 18 points for naming your document correctly. And since everyone named their document correctly, you all got 18 points. So yeah, so everyone did quite well on it because I can't do math. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording now. If you have any questions about anything we talked about today, feel free. Otherwise, we do not have class on Thursday. So I will see you next Tuesday. You have a homework due on Tuesday. It is already posted to the Blackboard. If you have any questions at any point leading up to Tuesday, let me know. So yeah, so basically just get it done and I will see you all next week. And otherwise, oh, as of now, I have still not gotten any word that we have met our vaccine quota. So as of now, we are still going forward, meeting online. And so I can guarantee next Tuesday, we will be online. And then if anything changes, I will let you all know. And again, as I said before, because we're doing online for so long, and I'm sure a lot of you had to move your schedules around or everything, I will somehow manage to make this class hybrid such that even if we go officially back to in person, you can still take this class on Zoom or at least watch the recordings. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording now. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to stay around and ask.